In this video, we're going to talk about Blender. Hey everyone, thanks for joining, and today I'm going to kick off some new videos where we introduce Blender. And I want to preface this by saying I am not a Blender expert. I'm an expert in a lot of areas, and specifically in parametric CAD, surfacing design, product design, and I do that in traditional CAD type packages like SolidWorks, Fusion 360, Inventor, and so on. But Blender is an amazing tool, and it's something that you can include in your parametric CAD workflow for various things like rendering or animation or particle simulation. So there are going to be a lot of times when we might want to go from Fusion 360 into Blender. So I think it's important that we first understand what Blender is and get a little bit of an overview of the interface and understand how we can move things around and we can work in Blender before we get started converting stuff from Fusion 360 and bringing it into Blender. So the first thing is, if you've never heard of Blender before, I suggest you go over to blender.org and check out this software because it is an amazing piece of software and it's completely free. Blender has been developed over many different years and it is born out of 3D animation. So this tool not only has 3D animation, but it has 2D animation, visual effects. It's got a lot of different artistic aspects in it. There have been plenty of different animated movies and features. You can create, again, particle physics and sort of these rendered animations. You can do a lot of different things with it. So check out blender.org, and in the video today and in all future videos we're going to be using the most current install of Blender, which is at this point in time 2.82a. So Blender received a major overhaul when it went to the 2.8 version. So if you're using an older version of Blender, maybe you've downloaded it and you've used it in the past and you just haven't kept up with it, make sure that you do install 2.82a or at least 2.8 or newer, because the user interface got a lot of great updates. It makes it much easier to use, especially if you're coming from another program such as Fusion 360 or SolidWorks or Inventor or anything else that is tailored towards mechanical design. You're going to have a much easier time with version 2.8. Once you go to blender.org, there's a lot of great information, but the first thing that you see on the page is the download. So they know exactly why you're there. You can go there, you can download, you can donate to help funding the development of Blender. So it's a great option, especially if you begin using it and really enjoy it. You can go ahead and just show them a little love by donating to the cause. There's also a lot of downloads and support. You can get into the documentation if you want to look at any help files. Again, we're not going to get too far into this. As I mentioned, I am not a Blender expert. Blender is amazing and I've been using it for a few years. I've been playing around with it for a few years, I should say. But I haven't devoted the time to really consider myself an expert. But what I do want to do is help you guys transition from the parametric CAD world. So again, if you're using Fusion or SolidWorks or Inventor or Creo or anything else, then I want to try to make that transition, because for me, I found it was very difficult to make the jump from a parametric mechanical CAD program into something like Blender. So we are going to jump into Blender 2.8. This is exactly what it looks like when you install it. I haven't really changed any settings. The user interface looks the same. There's a lot of customization that you can do, but I do just simply want to talk about what we see here when we open up Blender and how we can navigate and move things around. One of the things that you first want to do is simply just left click anywhere in this middle screen, and this is called the areas in Blender, and then you'll be working in sort of this layout workspace. So as we take a look at Blender, I want to note some of the basics of just working in Blender, moving things around, and I'm going to be relating these to what we're going to do with parametric CAD files that we bring in here. So we're not going to get too deep into animation or rendering or using the node renderer or using any of that other stuff in this video. We're going to really be focusing on just the user interface. The first thing that you want to note is that when you start any new general file in Blender, you'll have a camera, you'll have this cube, and you'll have a light. These are the three elements that are always in every new general file. In any video that you find on YouTube or anywhere else, likely is going to tell you to select everything and delete it. And while that is good information, we're going to leave this stuff in here because it's going to help us understand how to do things like rotate the view and what sort of mouse interactions we can have. I do want to note that I am using a PC, so I am on a Windows-based system. Some of these tips likely will be different depending on the system you're using, but it's a default install of Blender, and I'm using all the default settings, so I just want to make sure that that's clear on a Windows-based system. So the three main areas that we have inside of Blender are going to be the top bar, which is at the top, the areas, which is this big space that we have in the middle, which includes this sort of big window here where all the modeling is going to happen, the stuff that's over here on the right hand side. These are editors. It has the collections of scenes. It has modifiers that we're going to apply. And then the area on the bottom, this bottom area is, I believe, called the status bar. So there are a few different things that happen in different areas of this modeling window, and we're going to start to talk about things from the sort of from the beginning of what you would want to do inside of Blender. So if we left click on this cube, this representation of a cube inside of Blender, the two things that we might want to do with this cube are manipulate it in some way or change it in some way with modifiers. If we want to manipulate it, if we want to push and pull and tweak it and change it around, we need to go into a different mode called edit mode. Now, a shortcut key for this is tab. You can use tab to go back and forth, but I always like to make sure I understand where these commands actually are in the interface. So in the top left in Blender 2.8 or newer, you have this drop down that allows you to go into edit mode and back to object mode. And again, that's tab on the keyboard if you're familiar with shortcut keys and you want to use those. So when we're in this edit mode, you'll notice that the access to some of the tools on the left hand side change. You'll notice that we have this selection box, some of the things around us change, these menus change. So back in object mode, we have view, select, add, and object. We can do things like add new mesh elements, like new cubes, and the cube that's been added is in the exact same position and size as the one we're looking at. So if I want to move it around, I can click move. I can grab on one of these axes and simply pull it. And then depending on which one I have selected, tab goes into edit mode for that object. So again, select it, hit tab, or go into edit mode, and then you're back in sort of the space where we can do things to manipulate this object. So again, on the left-hand side, the tools change. We have move, rotate, scale, transform. Most of these things are going to have shortcut keys. For example, we can scale this without being in edit mode. We can be in object mode. With it selected, we still have access to scale. You will notice in some cases there'll be a small arrow in the bottom right-hand corner of this. You'll notice that we see it here as well. And that's not on all of the different items that we have access to. Move doesn't have it, rotate doesn't have it. It means that we have control over this with the cursor, I believe. So what I mean by that, for scale, for example, if I click on that, or if I am using the shortcut key of S, notice that the cursor on the screen has the two arrow hats and we're able to pull. This is sort of the same thing when we have the select box. We are using the cursor to sort of draw this out. So I believe that's what the arrow is. Maybe somebody that's more familiar with Blender can correct me, but it's not everywhere. For example, move is different because we actually have to select an axis or a plane that we want to move in. So just different things inside of the Blender environment that you might come across, and accessing these tools, again, they have different meanings or different values sometimes when you're in different modes. So for example, in edit mode, I can pick a vertex or vertice, and I can use the move command and I can pull this up and make some changes. I can select multiples and I can pull them up, and then I'm manipulating the shape of the object or the geometry of the object. While we're in object mode, it's all moving as one. So when I grab this and I hit G on the keyboard, I'm moving it. If I hit G and then I say Y, I'm only moving it in Y or only in X, or only in Z. So we have a lot of different options in terms of manipulating the object as a whole, or if we're manipulating the elements of that object in edit mode. So understanding those two modes is going to be a key to actually working with anything inside of Blender when we're talking about working with geometry or manipulating geometry. So again, we've added an object by using this add mesh. We can also add text, we can add surfaces or curves. We have a bunch of different things that we can do. When we select an object and we're in edit mode, we can manipulate the mesh by doing things like cleaning it up. We can decimate it. When we decimate it, that means that we're going to be changing the number of elements that are making that up. If we merge faces, if we split faces, we can do all these different things when we're working on it as this edit mode inside of the object itself. So I'm going to go back to object mode because what I want to explore here is not the creation of geometry or really manipulating the geometry. I want to make sure that we're comfortable with the interface. So once you understand that we have the object mode and the edit mode, those are the two main modes that we're going to be discussing. We will talk about some more as we get deeper into some tutorials, but understand that we have object and edit, how to get to them with the tab key or with this drop down, and what that really means. If we're moving an object or scaling it as a whole, or if we're moving individual elements of that object, such as the vertices. So now that we have that sort of transition between those two modes, the upper right hand area here is going to be some display options that we have. Some of the main ones we're going to go back and forth are between this wireframe and this shaded view. There are also some other ones that can show viewport shading and rendering directly in here. There's an options just above it that has some display options on it, and of course there are various things that we see up here. Selection boxes and the default orientation. So for example, we can use the local option for the coordinate system, and if we're selecting something that's curved, or in this case we have a box so it's going to be the same, but if we're selecting a face that's curved, then the orientation of the coordinate system is going to be normal to our selection. So some of these things can change. The top left, we have the this type of environment that we're working in. We're in the editor type, which is sort of a general thing, but we can also go directly into a 3D viewport, back and forth between an image editor, UV editor, a shader. We can go into a video sequencer. These are all different things that we can do in this main screen. The top area of the user interface, this is going to be the area where we have access to these different sort of workspaces. So right now we're in this layout. We can go to modeling, we can go to sculpting, we can go to UV editing, we can go into texture painting and shading and animation and rendering and so on. And all of these different workspaces that we can go into, very similar to Fusion 360, we have different workspaces where we might want to do different things. I want to point out that when we're in layout, we can go back and forth between that object and edit mode. When we go into modeling, this puts us into edit mode. So again, very similar, we can go back and forth in this layout mode, but the modeling workspace is going to automatically put us into that. So again, basic navigation, this is how we move around, this is how we sort of select things in Blender and how we work with them. When we look over in the right hand section, you can see that we've got this scene collections, and underneath there we have our camera, we have the original cube and the new cube that we created, and then we have this light. Each of these things can be made visible or hidden inside of here. If we expand them, it'll tell you that it has various parameters. So for example, if we select this, you can see that there is this triangle icon, and if we come down here, you can see that this is actually the data properties, and the properties can be changed. We can do things like have UV maps applied to them. We can do some things like we can create groups, and this group will be the selection of vertices that are currently highlighted in orange on the screen. We can use that for data later if we want to, but these icons are going to mean things. So now that we've created that group, you can see it's nested underneath there, and then That information is now part of that cube point 001 object that we're working with. As we select these different objects in here, with the exception of certain things, you'll notice that we have contextual tools. And when I say that, I mean it's based on our selection. So for example, if we select the cube, we have access to things like modifiers, particle systems. If we select the camera, we don't have the same sort of access, and it automatically goes to this camera icon, which allows us to toggle things like the focal length, the depth of field, whether or not we're using background images, some custom properties of the cameras. We can also do things like we can snap the camera to the current view that we have in the scene. So there are other ways that we can manipulate these cameras, and we'll get into that again more as it becomes applicable. I just want to make sure we understand that what we see on the right hand side over here is going to be based on our selection. When we talk about modifiers, that's going to be another important aspect of things that we do with these objects that we're going to be bringing in. Modifiers allow us to do things like create particle systems and particle simulations. It allows us to deform geometry. It allows us to generate geometry. It allows us to modify geometry. So when we do things like, let's go ahead and do a subdivision surface. It's going to take that box that we have, that cube that we have created, and we can turn it into a smoother object by subdividing it. So we've taken all the faces on that cube, we've got all the different outside faces of the box, and what we're telling it is that we want to divide those faces up into multiple subfaces. The quality settings that we have here for viewport and for render are going to determine what that thing looks like, and it's going to have some effect on our performance. The number of faces increases, the more it has to calculate in terms of rendering. If we're talking about things like specular spread, if we're talking about how light bounces off these objects, these values in render and viewport are going to be important. So again, these are modifiers that we can add to our objects here. For example, if I add a particle system and I navigate to this particle properties, we have 1,000 particles that are being created. If I go down to this viewport display and I turn off show emitter and I increase the size of this thing, what we're doing is we're making particles based on this object that we're working on. So we have all of these different elements that are dropping out of this object. So again, this is going to be another important thing that we play around with, and we're going to talk about that as it becomes applicable. I just want to make sure we understand where some of these things are and what they mean. So again, not important right now. Particle systems we will get to as we sort of progress through here. The stuff at the bottom, the playback and the timeline, is more important for animation. We're not going to be messing with it right now. It's in the view in this sort of layout workspace, and as soon as it becomes important to us, we will play around with it. Up in the right hand corner we have this XYZ, and this is a great way, a quick way for us to snap between different views. We can also right click, and when we're right clicking we have access to some of these other options. We can use Control A, which is apply, and we can do some other things like scale or transform or rotate. There are a lot of different ways in which we can access different things based on the selections inside of here. We'll get to more of those again as they become applicable, and I really just want to touch on a few more things before we wrap this video up because it's already about 20 minutes. The last thing that I really want to focus on is in the edit dropdown and in preferences. So if you guys have come from another program and you're used to working in however the controls are and whatever that program is, you can come into the Blender preferences and you can begin toggling the way things work in here for you. You can toggle your access to the menus. You can open on mouse over, for example. You can tweak key mapping and navigation. So right now the orbit method is turntable. You can turn it to trackball. You can change the sensitivity. You can change which method is used for zooming in. You can change how things move in and out. You can change shortcut keys. You can change all these different preferences. We will talk a little bit about add-ons in a future video because not everything is automatically enabled inside of Blender. A lot of stuff is in there, but you might need to go in and turn some stuff on, and we will talk about that. But this has been a very basic introduction overview to the user interface, and this is one of the biggest areas that I found difficult when just trying to get into Blender, because there's a lot here, and anytime you find a video online on YouTube or wherever, it's usually do this, click this, press this, hit this button, and stuff happens, and it's so hard to follow that you end up pausing so many different times, which is why I felt it was important to make this sort of general introduction without actually doing anything, because once we get into doing stuff, then we'll have to start to repeat it and commit it to memory. But now there's a basic overview of what Blender 2.8 looks like. Again, this is 2.82a. the most recent version as of May of 2020. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of familiarity with the interface, and in the next video we will actually start bringing stuff in from Fusion, and then we'll be applying some of these tools that hopefully you're now familiar with where you can access inside of Blender 2.8.